The most brutal sports of the Middle Ages were not games in the modern sense. They were rehearsals for violence, shaped by a society where injury was common, death was familiar, and entertainment demanded blood. These events were not marginal spectacles. They were public, celebrated, and often encouraged by authorities. Brutality was not a flaw, it was the point. At the center of medieval sports stood the tournament. What began as training for war quickly evolved into mass combat disguised as competition. Early tournaments were not polite jousts between two knights. They were chaotic melees involving dozens, sometimes hundreds of armored men charging across open fields. Teams clashed violently, capturing opponents for ransom, beating them unconscious, and occasionally killing them outright. Weapons were real, armor failed, bones broke regularly. Deaths were accepted as collateral. The joust, now romanticized, was itself a controlled form of extreme risk. Two knights rode at full speed toward each other with lances designed to shatter on impact, but often they did not. A direct hit could pierce armor, crush ribs, snap necks, or throw a rider violently to the ground. Falling at speed in heavy armor was frequently fatal. Kings died jousting. Nobles were crippled for life. Crowds cheered regardless. But knights were not the only participants in medieval brutality. Among common people, blood sports thrived. Wrestling was not recreational grappling, it was bone-breaking combat with few rules. Matches ended when one man could no longer stand. Fingers were snapped. Joints were destroyed. Permanent injury was expected. Victory was survival. Stick fighting and cudgel games were equally savage. Villagers armed themselves with heavy wooden clubs reinforced with iron. Blows targeted heads and limbs. Helmets were rare. Deaths were frequent. These games doubled as combat training and local rivalry resolution. Grudges ended or escalated under the guise of sport. Animal baiting ranked among the cruelest entertainments. Bears, bulls, and other animals were chained or confined while dogs were set upon them. The objective was prolonged suffering. Crowds gathered to watch animals bleed, struggle, and die slowly. This was not fringe behavior. It was mainstream amusement across medieval Europe, enjoyed by all social classes. Hunting, often idealized, was another brutal sport. It was not merely about food. It was about domination. Animals were chased to exhaustion, cornered, stabbed at close range. Boar hunting was especially lethal. Wounded boars killed men regularly, goring horses and hunters alike. Death was a known risk and part of the appeal. Even children were exposed early. Mock battles, stone throwing, and dangerous games were common. Injury was treated as instruction. Pain taught limits. Survival selected the rest. Medieval sport did not protect the body, it tested it until it failed. What unified these activities was not skill alone, but tolerance for harm. There was no expectation of safety, no medical support worth mentioning. A broken leg could end a life. An infected wound could kill weeks later. Participants accepted this without illusion. Religion did not restrain brutality. Clergy condemned excess in theory, but tournaments and blood sports continued openly. Violence framed as tradition or training escaped moral scrutiny. When death occurred, it was attributed to fate or divine will, not poor design. Spectators understood what they were watching. This was not illusion or performance. It was real risk unfolding in public. Cheers rose when blood was spilled. Silence followed when someone failed to rise. Then the event continued. These sports reflected a world shaped by constant conflict. Medieval society was violent not because it lacked refinement, but because survival demanded familiarity with pain. Sport became a controlled outlet for instincts forged by war, hunger, and insecurity. And this brutality was not accidental. It was cultivated, because in a world where war was inevitable, the line between training, entertainment, and death was thin and deliberately ignored. This was only the beginning of how medieval sport blurred that line. Beyond tournaments and village games, medieval brutality reached its most extreme form in spectacles designed purely for dominance and endurance. These were not sports meant to refine the body or entertain gently. They were trials meant to expose weakness. elevate aggression, and remind everyone watching how fragile life truly was. Public executions often blurred into sport-like events. Crowds gathered not only for justice, but for sensation. Swordsmanship displays accompanied beheadings. Hangings became communal gatherings. The skill of the executioner was judged openly. A clean strike was praised. A failure provoked anger. Death became performance, and performance became expectation. Archery contests were no less dangerous. While framed as skill competitions, they demanded immense physical strain. Heavy warbows required years of conditioning. Misfires shattered arms. Strings snapped into faces. Targets were sometimes placed near crowds. Accidents were frequent, yet participation remained widespread because archery was survival training disguised as sport. Mounted games added further risk. Quintain competitions where riders struck rotating targets at speed were notorious for killing participants. A poorly timed hit could send a rider flying headfirst into the ground. Horses panicked. Armor restricted movement. Fatal falls were common. These games trained reflexes for war, but at a cost measured in broken necks and crushed spines. Even festivals carried danger. Shrovetide football, an ancestor of modern soccer, involved entire villages fighting over a ball through streets, rivers, and fields. There were no teams, no limits, no protective rules. Punching, kicking, stabbing, and trampling were expected. Property was destroyed. Men died. Authorities attempted bans repeatedly and failed. The violence was too culturally embedded. What made medieval sport uniquely brutal was its honesty. There was no illusion of safety, no separation between athlete and soldier. The same body trained for competition trained for killing. Injury was not an exception, it was evidence of participation. Medical support was almost non-existent. Broken bones healed crooked. Concussions were ignored. Internal injuries went untreated. Pain was endured publicly. Complaints were seen as weakness. Those who could not continue simply disappeared from competition and often from life expectancy. Status did not guarantee protection. Nobles died in tournaments as readily as peasants died in games. Kings themselves were injured or killed during sport. Authority encouraged participation, but could not escape consequence. This unpredictability only increased fascination. Violence also reinforced hierarchy. Spectators learned their place by watching who survived and who fell. Strength commanded respect. Endurance commanded fear. Sport became a language of power understood without explanation. Over time, attempts were made to soften the edge-blunted weapons, restricted rules, formalized jousts. But even these reforms came late and rarely worked. Human bodies collided at speed. Steel met flesh. Risk remained irreducible. The medieval appetite for brutal sport did not arise from cruelty alone. It grew from necessity. A world without security required constant readiness. Physical dominance was not entertainment, it was insurance. The body was the first and last defense. And so medieval sport remained violent until violence itself became obsolete. Only when standing armies replaced individual prowess, when gunpowder made strength secondary, did brutality begin to retreat from sport into memory. The games softened because the world changed. But for centuries, competition meant confrontation. Entertainment meant exposure to death. And sport meant proving again and again that the body could endure what the age demanded. This was not excess. It was preparation. As the medieval world matured, brutality in sport did not fade, it became ritualized. Violence was organized, scheduled, and anticipated. Entire calendars revolved around events where injury was expected and death was tolerated. Communities prepared not for safety but for spectacle. Crowds gathered early. Markets formed around arenas and fields. Alcohol flowed freely. Anticipation mattered as much as outcome. People did not come only to see who won. They came to see who broke. A shattered lance, a rider thrown motionless to the ground, blood on sand or grass. These moments carried weight. They reminded everyone watching that strength was temporary and survival uncertain. The line between participant and spectator was thin. A misdirected horse, a splintered weapon, a panicked animal, any could spill violence into the crowd. Injuries among onlookers were not rare. This danger was accepted. Being close to violence was part of the experience. Distance implied weakness. Medieval sport also served as judgment. Reputation was forged publicly. A man who performed well gained status. One who hesitated lost it. Failure followed participants long after the event ended. Skill in violent sport translated directly into social authority. Physical dominance was proof of worth. This applied even beyond men. Animals were forced into these spectacles as unwilling participants, their suffering drawn out deliberately. Bulls bled until collapse. Bears were torn apart slowly. The cruelty was not incidental, it was essential. Endurance of pain, whether human or animal, reinforced the idea that the world itself was unforgiving. Compassion was a liability. What modern eyes often miss is that medieval spectators did not view these events as entertainment detached from reality. They saw them as mirrors. War, famine, disease, life itself was brutal. Sport simply concentrated that brutality into moments that could be watched, cheered, and understood. There was no expectation that participants would be protected by rules. Rules existed to shape violence, not eliminate it. When rules failed, the crowd did not protest. They leaned in. Even attempts to civilize sport came with resistance. Bans on village football were ignored. Restrictions on tournaments were bypassed. When authorities tried to limit violence, communities treated it as interference with tradition. Brutality was cultural inheritance. In this context, injury was not tragedy, it was validation. Pain proved participation. Scars were credentials. Survival signaled strength. Those who walked away intact were admired, but those who returned broken were remembered. Eventually, change arrived not through morality, but technology. Gunpowder altered warfare. Mass armies replaced individual prowess. Skill with weapons mattered less than discipline and numbers. As physical dominance lost strategic value, sport began to change with it. Violence receded slowly. Rules multiplied. Protective measures appeared. Spectacle softened. But this was not progress in the medieval sense. It was adaptation to a different world. For centuries before that shift, the most brutal sports of the Middle Ages served a clear purpose. They hardened bodies. They taught pain. They filtered weakness. They entertained by exposing reality rather than escaping it. These were not diversions from medieval life. They were expressions of it. A society accustomed to death did not shy away from watching it approach. And so medieval sport remained unforgiving, because the world it reflected was unforgiving too. That is why brutality was not hidden. It was celebrated. And why the most dangerous games were never considered excess, they were considered necessary.